I'm very happy that we have Professor Vishweswar Rao, the former Vice Chancellor of Vikramasinghe University and a retired Professor of English from Krishnadevaraya University, Anantapur. Professor Vishweswar Rao has spent long years in education. He has been associated with various committees and a very prolific writer and reader. I have also had the privilege of working with Professor Vishweswar Rao in a number of committees pertaining to Andhra University, etc. I am indeed very happy that Professor Vishweswar Rao has agreed to review the book written by Dr. Vaijanatha Iyer. I'm also happy that Mr. Vaijanatha Iyer, who has written the book titled The Holy Grail, India's Quest for Universal Elementary Education, is also here with us. And it's indeed an opportunity for us to be able to review his book, a very well-written book. Professor Vishweswar Rao, kindly have the book reviewed, and then if there are any questions, we can take them. Over to Mr. Vishweswar Rao.
Thank you very much, Sri Chakrapani garu, for introducing me to a very distinguished audience. I feel extremely humble to address this distinguished gathering, especially in the presence of a very fine writer, Vishwanatha Iyer garu, whom I met a few years ago in some context. I'll just give you a preview of the book. Here is the book which I am going to review. Vaijanatha Iyer's The Holy Grail, India's Quest for Universal Elementary Education. This was published by Oxford University in 2016. It's a voluminous book coming to about 707 pages. The book has a very arresting title. The Holy Grail reminds us of the cultural crisis of the post-World War civilization, and T.S. Eliot's a line in his Wasteland wherein he says, "Shall I at least set my lands in order?" It reminds us of Jesse L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance, whose main focus is on the Holy Grail tradition and its influence, particularly on the motif of the wasteland. The impotence of the Fisher King condemns the land around him to similar infertility, which is a broader metaphor for the deracinated civilization it saw around him. The term Holy Grail used to denote an elusive object or goal that is sought after for its great significance. This is what gives Sri R. Vaijanatha Iyer the inspiration to dwell upon the theme of universal elementary education. It represents the unattainable perfection that King Arthur's knights strove towards. Universalization of elementary education seemed an elusive dream and also a talisman for national growth, both. This Sri Vaijanatha Iyer examines in all its ramifications in this remarkable, profoundly scholarly book, a narrative written in a lucid, enticingly readable style. The Holy Grail captures in graphic detail India's efforts at universalization of elementary education following the implementation of the National Policy on Education 1986 until its culmination in the Right to Education Act 2009. Vaidyanatha Iyer reveals in this book the zeal and aptitude of an ardent researcher who meticulously furrows the field of his inquiry, but without drawing support from charts, bar diagrams, and statistical data that a social scientist normally bamboozles. He also shows in abundance the historian's instinct for tracing the origins of, documenting, evaluating, and comparing an array of developments in the area of elementary education in the period after 1986. In the process, he provides the reader with hindsight and foresight, and also with the ideational and critical framework against which to examine fascinating developments that strive to fulfill important constitutional mandate. Adhayar examines issues against the national and global context. The Holy Grail analyzes and evaluates various programs such as the Mahila Samakhi, Total Literacy Campaigns, Bihar Education Project, the District Primary Education Project, launched in 1994 as a major initiative to achieve the objective of universal elementary education, and of course its progeny, Sarva Siksha Abhiyan, and outlines the challenges ahead. With a keen critical eye, Vaidyanatha identifies the gaps between conceptualization and implementation and offers valuable comments on them. He analyzes the processes and inner workings of the mind behind these systems, structures, and thought processes in this gripping narrative, difficult to lay aside in spite of the density of its material. As Vaidyanatha Iyer mentions in his preface, in his subject, he gives importance to the travails of the rather than the destination as such. In 1990, the International Literacy Year, about 1,500 delegates from 155 countries and representatives of some 150 governmental and non-governmental intergovernmental organizations met at the World Conference on Education for All in Jomtien, Thailand, and called upon all countries to universalize basic education. The conference adopted the World Declaration on Education for All and a framework for action as well, which paved the way for spectacular progress India had made with the UEE. India's success in achieving the UEE, ability to mobilize large-scale funding from a variety of development agencies like the World Bank, the European Community, DFID, and UNICEF. Vaidyanatha Iyer frankly admits that working with Bordia, Anil Bordia, the Secretary of Education at that time, helped him understand the historical and social context behind education, the national and perspectives on it, and the design and the execution of the various projects. Vaidyanatha Iyer pays Anil Borde a great literary compliment, which the reader of Holy Grail tends to pay him, that is Vaidyanatha Iyer. Vaidyanatha Iyer, I may say, in the manner in which he has said about Anil Borde, is both a hedgehog and a fox both, if you analyze the Holy Grail. Referring to the famous line by the ancient poet Antilochus, the foxes know many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Isaiah Berlin identified some writers and thinkers as hedgehogs and foxes. For example, Dante, Nietzsche, and Hegel are described as hedgehogs, while Shakespeare, Molière, Goethe are described as foxes. With the zeal of a teacher as also an insider, Vaidyanath Iyer discusses the role of the states and their engagement with the idea of promoting the UEE project. By tracing the history of universalization of primary education, he goes back to the Indian origins of the impulse in a note to nativity of a different kind, as it were. He says that Maharani Gauri Parvati Bai of Travancore, from where much later came the enlightened educationist Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer as the Diwan, issued a royal rescript in 1817 declaring the state defray the entire cost of education of its people to banish backwardness and to usher in enlightenment. How noble of her! This royal rescript was issued 73 years before Japan's Emperor Meiji issued an imperial rescript in his own country. There are certain significant milestones reached in universalizing primary education, and Vaidyanath Iyer records them in this book. Between 2002 and 2014, remarkable progress was achieved in promoting and reaching the targets of the UEE. If the figure of out-of-school children in the age group of 6 and 14 stood at 2.5 crores in 2002, in 2014 it narrowed down to 60 lakhs. But the challenge lay in luring the hardcore marginalized groups to school and leading the nation towards providing inclusive education. And in this book, Vaidyanath Iyer places himself in the role of a Greek chorus, that is, in the role of a participant, observer, and commentator, in giving us a picture of picture as a pointsman, as he calls it, who was instrumental in building up the interface between the Department of Education and agencies like the Department of International Education, Swedish International Development Agency, European Union, UNDP, UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank. Iyer calls this book his story and not history. That is part personal reminiscence and part history. And assuredly, there is no viewing of history through the prism of ideology in this book. Vaidyanath Iyer turns the I into a, that is K, reminding us of the protagonist of Kafka's The Castle, published in 1926. This pronominal to the third person gives him the strength in maintaining his anonymity, in maintaining the anonymity of the I. Adopting third person narrational posture, intentionally seeking to efface self-referentiality, the I in the narrative seeks to place the locus of identity upon an impersonal public construct. The public construct therefore masquerades as not Vaidyanath Iyer, but then as a relational not to be distanced from the private self. Kafka's novel, The Castle, is a very interesting novel because it doesn't have an ending. The Castle is the story of K, who claims to be a land surveyor sent by someone unknown for some purpose unknown to the castle itself an unknown. The castle is about alienation, unresponsive bureaucracy, and the implications of choosing this particular K as the mediatory agency through which the narrative is placed before us. The castle is about alienation, unresponsive bureaucracy, the frustration of trying to conduct business with non-transparent, arbitrary controlling systems, and the futile pursuit of an unattainable goal. The Holy Grail, carrying these implications, is divided into 20 chapters, runs to 707 pages, beginning with a long list of abbreviations and ending with an exhaustive index. Critical scrutiny and anecdote in Baijanatha Iyer's narrative. It's partly memoir in which wisdom and self-knowledge of the author narrate. The definition of memoir is similar to that of autobiography. In fact, many consider memoir to be a subset of the genre of autobiography. But there is a difference, however. An autobiography span of life, whereas a memoir is usually centered upon a specific part of life here in the field of education, universalization of education, and the challenges that lay before him. A memoir might cover an important turning point in a person's life or a particularly memorable story, or it may be a group of touchstone events in one's life. An important feature of the Holy Grail is that it's a graphic account in depth and detail, and also a subtle critique of various educational programs like the EGS, the para-teacher system, and the total literary campaigns. It's a supposedly defamiliarized narrative of a person who played a crucial role in the design, planning, and execution of the UEE, participating in the negotiations with the government and agency functionaries at various meetings and conferences. We supposedly hear K in the narrative and not Baijanatha Iyer, though I would refer to the name Baijanatha Iyer as the author of the book, as the one who mediates his vision through this book. The Tinsel Town is the first chapter in the novel, where, among other things, he brings to the fore the maladies of the system, like over-regulation and weak enforcement, the proliferation of the private sector into the primary and secondary education segment, and the sad neglect of infrastructure development. The Secondary Education Commission observed in 1956 that government schools were no longer models to emulate. In 1950, the provision of universal primary education, that is, free and compulsory education for all children until they completed the age of 14 years, was incorporated in Article 45 of the Constitution of India. The provision of universalization of primary education was scheduled to be achieved by 1960. In view of immense difficulties such as lack of adequate resources, rapid increase in the population, resistance to girl education, large number of children backward in very low literacy regions, general of the people, apathy of illiterate parents, these are all the reasons that Vaijanatha Iyer cites. It was not possible to make adequate progress, and as such, the constitutional directive remained partly unfulfilled. Vaijanatha Iyer's book gives us a glimpse into the history of different commissions and committees which were seized with the universalization idea. I may bring in here a reference to the National Education Policy 2020, which seeks to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all by 2030, in tune with the global education development agenda reflected in Goal 4 of SDGs, the Agenda for Sustainable Development adopted in 2015. Such a lofty goal would require the entire education system to be reconfigured to support and to foster learning, as the NEP points out. The NEP 2020 is on early childhood care and education, ECC, and linking the Anganwadi centers with it, and developing a national curricular and pedagogical framework for this ECCE address indeed grassroots realities of school education, and stimulating the growth of education through Angalwadi centers can be considered to be the equivalent of a Gandhian initiative, rural reconstruction. The first project, coming back to Sri Baijanatha Iyer's book, the first project funded by an external agency was the Andhra Pradesh Primary Education Project, APPEP, funded by the UR's Overseas Development Administration, with a focus on activity-based child-centered learning known as activity-based learning, ABL. This method became an inspiration for subsequent schemes like the DPEP and the Sarva Siksha Abhiyan. What was unique to this and what was also a hindrance was that appraisal, planning, monitoring, and project evaluation were all undertaken by the British experts with no role for local institutions or the national resource centers like the NCERT and the state education departments. Rectified later in the designing of the DEP, where the agency functionaries or their consultants were kept away from planning and implementation of the programs, with their roles restricted to visiting the states for interaction and for appraisal as part of a joint review mission. NPE 1986 drew from and called for a child-centered approach in primary education and launched the Operation Blackboard in 87-88 with the aim of providing improved infrastructure in schools. Vaijanatha Iyer traces the spectacular history wherein he traces this particular spectacular history wherein he shows how the APPEP phase 2 with its outlay of 30 million pounds brought about key pedagogic innovations like activity-based child-centered learning, learning by doing, drawing upon the local environment process of teaching, and in-service training for the teacher. Did activity-based learning succeed as a strategy for the classroom? This is one question which Vaijanatha Iyer examines. He gives a balanced account of its failure and blames it on the serfdom to the British through the serfdom to the British through the Raj. But from his point of view, it gave him an insight into human behavior and into the dynamics of organizational behavior. There's another chapter, The Great Master, which gives us an excellent pen portrait of Bordia. Bordia, Vaijanatha Iyer says, had a remarkable ability to turn men into mice, which leaves K, as he says, metamorphosed back and forth. I'm quoting him. Both the past master in the use of what he describes as constructive ambiguity, an example of oxymoron, by the deliberate use of ambiguous language on sensitive issues. And Baijanatha again sums up his personality by saying, Borde was a classic example of a person who could. In his various interactions, Vaijanatha Iyer learned challenges of access, participation, quality, and equity. Not amenable to quick fixes, though the UNESCO representatives thought there were quick fixes. A very distinguished feature of the whole tale is that Vaijanatha Iyer, the scholar that he is, the contemplative man, as Milton would describe the likes of him, untwisting all the chains that tie the hidden soul of harmony. He takes us through a maze of thought on education and its philosophical foundation. In developing of universal education, Vaidyanath Iyer says that the ideas of Freire and Ivan Illich, as exemplified in Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Deschooling Society, were very useful. Roy Prosser, British adult educator, and Philip Coombs, author of The World Educational Crisis, raised an important question. Would linear expansion lead to the democratization of education, to the creation of manpower required for modernization and development of the economy? Coombs highlighted the fact that impressive increase in enrollment and enrollment ratios a darker side, which was dropouts and failures, which led to a vast social waste and a human tragedy. This led to thinking on the lines of lifelong learning, continuous learning. This paradigm shift to the rise of non-formal education to catch up, as points out. Baidyanath Iyer shows himself in this book as one who would associate himself with policy enunciation after a careful study of the history of ideas behind it. How ideas have been absorbed in various and against what theoretical premises and sociological contexts. When he analyzes the age of alternatives, the period from mid-60s to the 70s, he draws his insights from a formidable range of work to be taken into consideration, like Philip Coombs' The World Education Crisis, Philip Coombs again, The New Paths to Learning for Rural Education and Youth, UNESCO's Forey Commission report, Learning to Be, published in 1972, leading finally to education for all as per the Jomtien Declaration, the Hattock Committee's ideas of consolidation rather than expansion, wherein it is pointed out that 60% of the primary schools were run by single teachers and teachers were not adequately trained, and the establishment of the school was unplanned and disproportionate, and the school curriculum further was unrelated to life. The concept of basic education as visualized by the Jomtien Declaration included formal primary schooling, NFE, adult education. The need for different delivery systems was recognized because the basic needs of children, youth, and adults were different and diverse, and therefore primary schooling, non-formal education, and adult education were all required to be pursued. Vaidyanath Iyer devotes considerable space to the Kotha and its purpose of giving good general education of 7 years duration, which calls for, among other things, provision of schools in the vicinity, enrollment to propaganda, mediation, and even penal action, retention at school till 14 years of age, and liberal target fixing in the context of meeting the constitutional obligation, and inclusion of components of full-time education, part-time study, and self-study. Learning by doing partly involves that. Baidyanath Iyer frankly admits that the National Policy on Education 1986 failed to produce results, especially in the matter of addressing out-of-school children. But higher education seized the opportunity here, is ironically, of drawing upon the ascendancy of this idea of lifelong education. And unfortunately, as Baidyanath Iyer readily recognizes, distance education became the milch cow and also beard by correspondence, which all watered down the quality of education. With regard to the higher education scene, PE 1986 gave unqualified priority to universalization of elementary education with its thrust on universal of children up to the age of 14. As the NEP 20 notes, the GER for grades 6 to 8 was 90.9%, while for grades 9 to 10 and 11 to 12, it was only 79% and 56.5% respectively. A proportion of enrolled students drop out after grade 5, especially at grade 8. It's a top priority to bring children fold as soon as possible, and therefore the goal to achieve 100% gross enrollment in preschool level to secondary school level by 2030 is insisted upon by the National Education Policy 2020. Here raises some important questions in the context of certain demotivating factors for children and their parents also. He says, is policy making mere packaging? He asked this question. Does policy raise questions such as ensuring that all children 6 to 14 years are enrolled and they complete 8 years of elementary education and learn through this what they are expected to learn? What are the expectations in this regard? Once again, I would come back to the National Education Policy 2020, which defines those functions as follows. It says that its objective is to address the development imperatives of our country. It proposes a revamping of the educational structure. It aims to develop both foundational capacity of literacy and numeracy and higher order cognitive capabilities such as critical thinking and problem solving, in addition to developing social, ethical, and emotional capacity in children. Coming back to Sri Vaidyanath Iyer's book, in chapter 7 of the book, from Akshara Keralam to Akshara Bharatam, Vaidyanath Iyer speaks about the spread of total literacy campaigns, which became a hot topic during the review of the National Education 86. He speaks about how this idea caught on and to start with how 12 districts spread over Kerala, Pondicherry and West Bengal became totally literate. It was later discovered that the Ernakulam model had limitations and could not be replicated in the low literacy districts. By January 1992, total literacy campaigns were in progress in 65 districts, and over 10 lakh volunteers and 4 crore learners were participating in them. Tracing the history of the growth of TLCs and adult education and how these have been used with an ideology orientation or nationalist agenda, Vaidyanath Iyer shows how social education was the dominant fashion till the 1950s. Economically functional literacy became the fashion in the 60s. Conscientization-driven education, adult education, became the order of the day in the 70s, and entitlement-driven adult education became fashionable in the mid-80s. In the mid-60s, in the matter of functional literacy, functionality was defined in terms of enhancing the productivity of the activities of the learners. Thus came about Farmers Training and Functional Literacy Project, which was in operation for about a decade from 1968. This was financed by UNESCO and the UNDP under the scheme of Experimental World Literacy Projects. A 1976 evaluation of this Experimental World Literacy Project led to another change of conception. Vaidyanath Iyer traces the history of literacy movements in terms of global changes. He says, Freirean pedagogy and the declaration of Persepolis gave literacy a theoretical orientation. Freire calls traditional pedagogy the banking model of education because it treats students like a piggy bank, empty but filled with knowledge. He argues that pedagogy should instead treat the learner as a co-creator of knowledge. The International Symposium for Literacy, meeting in Persepolis in September 1975, adopted a declaration which considered literacy to be not just the process of learning the skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but making a contribution to his full development. From this inspiration, Baijanatha Iyer says, arose Malcolm Adiseshaya's document Functionality of Literacy, a wider package of literacy combined with the ability to understand social reality, participate in decision-making processes, and understanding the concept of living in an equitable social and political order. From this emanated the National Adult Education Policy targeting 10 crore persons in the age group of 15 to 35 years over a 5-year period and imparting to them literacy, functionality, and awareness. In chapter 18, entitled The Crucible of Fire, Vaijanatha Iyer gives a vivid account of the progress of the UEE. He details how it bogged down in bureaucracy and in a nexus with the politicians in Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh. There was lack of agreement between officials of donor agencies and the state education department officials. In chapter 20, Caterpillar to Butterfly, Vaijanatha Iyer refers to the performance evaluation of DPEP projects in terms of evaluation of achievements with regard to process, output, and outcome. Evaluation of the program's contribution to enhancing the capacity of the state education system as a whole. Paradigm shift the DPEP envisaged, Vaijanatha points out, encompasses 5 areas. They are curriculum, learning process, the teaching learning material, service training necessary for the teachers, and evaluation. The broad principles of DPEP were drawn from the MPE 1980 and the POA as revised in 1992, and also from the lessons inferred from Siksha Karmi and the APPEP. In the area of pedagogy, it was influenced by the idea of the minimum levels of learning, which outlined for each subject in a class. But then Vaijanatha points out that the MLLs are not favored by the NCERT and the SCERT. By the constructivists that the MLLs limit the scope of education to the mere cognitive domain. The idea of dividing a subject again into certain competencies to be mastered one after the other, Vaijanatha says, an epistemologically unsound philosophical proposition, not supported by theories of learning. In 2005, the new National Curricular Framework came forward with its emphasis on the constructivist approach. It strongly denounced their rigid adherence to year-end outcomes. Constructivist view acquired legal sanction, he says, in the RTE Act of 2009. But one feature that by excels in his way through theoretical premises and analyzing issues based on those premises. Of reviews of the DPEP project reviews in terms of enrollment, retention, content, and the process of education. At the end, he points out that it is difficult to assess such a complex project as the DPEP because of its large outreach on the and also because of a variety of program interventions that were associated with the project. Assessment, he says, is further complicated by the fact that the DPEP was managed by multiple external agencies. Each of them had their own criteria of evaluation. He therefore contends that the DPEP effect could have been delivered better by means of a proper proper adoption of a survey model. It would have been discovered better if in every DPEP state, the size of the projects covered in all districts with levels of educational indicators as close as possible to those of the DPEP districts. The response DPEP was left with the task of appraising the annual work plans drawn up by the state functionaries. Thus, figuratively, the DPEP taught the states, as Vaijanatha Iyer points out, to catch fish, but it did not do fishing by itself. This is a very sarcastic observation. Since own kind of DPEP, he says a seamless narrative became difficult to obtain. He further says that no detailed studies of the and institution pedagogic and quality improvement were available. There are various aspects of consideration, and Vaijanatha Iyer points out how a number of these areas were left uncovered in the assessment of the project. He penetrating observations of the DPEP project, it ushered in. However, by laying down targets and specifying processes for assessment and implement for assessment, it has paved the way for a strong MIS system leading to the creation of an educational database, a system for education, DSA, developed by the National University of Educational Planning and Administration, which now also covers the entire elementary as well as secondary education levels under UDSA. But the DPEP left out several areas such as teacher recruitment, rejuvenation of state education departments, professionalization of the functionaries of those departments. It attempted some networking of professional institutions like SCERTs and the diets. But then, as Vaijanatha rightly points out, the SCERTs were more or one significant feature of the functioning of the DPEP was that it encouraged the local communities enhancing the effectiveness of the schools. As a result, parent-teacher associations, etc., came up. About 50 lakh such bodies were created. The DPE substantial training opportunities these for their capacity developments. These bodies over a period of time rose of running campaigns to monitoring their attendance, performing watchdog, taking up school construction works, activity. A great initiative indeed. However, the DPEP demonstrated differential performance across different states, from which Vaijanatha Iyer comes to the conclusion that setting uniform goals across all districts was a mistake. facilitate learning for students with special focus on the socio-economically disadvantaged groups. The National Education Policy 2020 proposes to enlarge the scope of school education by both formal and informal sectors. ODL systems are sought to be employed in the process. In the case of Abhiyan, which became a new avatar of the DPEP, the question was to what extent DPEP influenced the design and implementation of the SSA. That foundation laid by the DPEP, the transition to the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan would not have been so easy. In the process, the author gives us a critical scrutiny of many accompanying processes, such as the NFE programs, their design in the system of primary education, the para-teacher system, privatization of primary education, and so on. The Holy Grail offers comprehensive critique of various aspects of primary elementary education, the curriculum design, the pedagogical models, the teaching learning process, teacher training, educational database, evaluation study, studies criticizing external funding and elementary education, and so on. The 5-year plan, a year after the launch of SSA, Operation Blackboard and the NFE were subsumed in the SSA. The Kasturba Gandhi Balika Vidyalaya scheme, which was set up with residential upper primary schools for girls belonging predominantly to the SC, ST, OBC groups and minority communities, were also subsumed in SSA. Gradually, SSA became the sole national program for universalizing elementary education and supporting schemes such as teacher education and the nutritional program and the national program of nutritional support to primary education, commonly called the midday meals scheme, launched in 1995 and aimed at improving enrollment, attendance, and retention in the primary classes. The structures of the DPEP were assimilated into the SSA, as all monitoring and evaluation mechanisms put in place by the DPEP. The SSA thus inherited, as Vaidyanatha Iyer points out, a tested mechanism with which has developed an enormous manpower. The DPEP in its first 3 focused upon participation, addressed gender disparities in retention, and in the process, SC/ST to the SSA to address. He points out what the lacunae were that were later taken up in the SSA. But it made spectacular progress in addressing the special needs of children with disabilities, the DPEP project. The NPE emphasized the need for special schools for children with severe disabilities. Again, the question for me is, from Vaidyanatha Iyer's point of view, where from does this idea come? Vaidyanatha Iyer goes in search of where they germinated or where it gathered momentum and mentions the Sargent Commission of 1944, Thari Commission, and the corresponding policy postulate of the National Policy on Education 1986. The central government in 1987, but the outlay on it was just 2 crores, whereas the outlay on Operation Blackboard was 125 crores. But The DPEP provided space for innovation and took up with a zeal the issue of children with disabilities. It provided scope for flexibility in its program so that these were accommodated and oriented pedagogic support. Similarly, curricular modifications related to this were made, and support and training were also offered. In the light of all this, firmly believes that but for the resources and space provided by the DPEP, the education of the People with Disabilities Act 1995 might not have got such a boost. The framework for the implementation in 2005 and next in 2011 in pursuance of the right to 2009. The most significant aspect of the revision of 2011, as Vaidyanath Iyer points out, was the decision not to find alternatives to schooling. In the case of the DPEP, it followed a certain method of distribution of funds whereby states were classified as World Bank states, EC states, DFID states. But the SSA deviated from this model rightly, not a harmonizing of procedures through MOUs with the central government on common formats. This is a very important innovation the SSA introduced. It evolved a national system of monitoring, financial management as well, and procurement. The overall Global Monitoring Report 2015 offers an overview of the progress towards education for all during the period from 2000 to 2015. It commends India for making marked progress in net enrollment ratio. The EFA was adopted framework in April 2000 at the World Education Forum in Senegal, Africa, with the goal in mind that all children would receive primary education by 2015. The EFA goals also contribute to the global pursuit of the Millennium Development Goals, especially the M2 on universal primary education and MDG 3 on gender equity in education. These are to be pursued by 2015. Also commended India for reaching gender parity for primary and lower secondary enrollment, the only country in South and West Asia to do so. Vaidyanath premise, we come back again to K, rather K's premise is on Karl Marx's The German Ideology, where Marx states before man ideas can be made, man must first be fed, clothed, sheltered. Likewise, children from disadvantaged backgrounds must be helped to acquire basic learning, writing, reading, and numerical skills before they realize higher pedagogic goals such as critical thinking and learning to learn. Here is where probably we can notice that there is a shift of emphasis in 20, and I don't know how Sri Vaidyanath Iyer would would view the goals as envisaged by the NEP 2020. But there are differences in curricular design, as Vaidyanath finds out, because the linear sequences, the competency tests were drawn up, were on the one hand taken extreme. Again, there was some absurdity with this testing model because led to gross distortions in teaching and learning. And as Vaidyanath Iyer points out, the decade that followed the launching of the DPEP in November 1994 was a hectic period of experimentation with ideas in the area of pedagogy as well. The Act came into being because the UEE was proving elusive. It was felt that an irrevocable legal binding was necessary to compel governments to ensure that the UEE became a recognizable goal. But after, by makes a thought-provoking observation in this context that improvement of quality and learning achievement are more challenging than enhancing access and enrollment. They require intense planning and monitoring. What is tangible is classrooms built, toilets provided, number of teachers appointed, number of training programs conducted. But the extent to which training communicates the new pedagogy, the degree of absorption by the teachers and by the students, the teachers' willingness to replace their methods by the new ones, these essays are not tangible, nor are they quantifiable. Baidyanath Iyer sees a glimmer of hope in the NCERT in its striving towards the development of indicators for classes 1 to classes 8. Finally, we notice that learner outcomes come back into the spotlight. The National Education Policy 2020 points out that children should not only learn, but more importantly, learn how to learn. Education thus must move towards less content, as the NEP 2020 points out, but move towards learning about how to think critically and solve problems, how to be creative and multidisciplinary, and how to innovate and adapt ourselves to and absorb new materials in novel ways. Provide schools, now coming to private schools, Baidyanath Iyer has some important observations. He raises the question of whether they matter for private unaided institutions, he says, account for an increasing proportion of total enrollment, primary and upper primary stages. According to the National Sample Survey data of 2007-8, private unaided primary schools enrolled about a fifth of the total boys in rural as well as urban areas, with girls enrolled lower, and the clientele come from across the social spectrum. The cardinal policy postulate, he says, therefore, cannot exclude the private unaided sector. Now I would conclude. The Holy Grail is a frank, scholarly, insightful assessment of various programs launched, contribution, the trajectory of their growth, the expertise that was associated with their formulation, and the theoretical assumptions behind. That is very important. The theoretical assumptions behind them. The book offers a frank and reasoned assessment of the reach of the programs, the methodology they employed in order to acquire this reach, and the shortfalls of that methodology. T.S. Eliot speaks about the poet in the 20th century. He says that the poet in the 20th century ought to be acquainted with the mind of Europe. This historical sense Baidyanath Iyer displays in abundance, while revealing his own individual talent in subtleties of analysis that he offers, to which I made very broad reference. Always backed up by research into the origins or the philosophical foundations of the ideas behind the programs. He therefore sees things steadily and sees them as a whole, as Matthew Arnold would insist upon. And thus his criticism is inclusive and stems from a comprehensiveness of outlook and assessment. He prepared a careful backdrop of national and global educational developments and their contexts against which to evaluate programs on offer. Rich in its content and free from the social scientists' document modality, the whole is a unique narrative. I may make a reference to some typos which I noticed. A reviewer ought to do that. In 118, the word in was repeated twice, which was in operation, in for. In page 103, so designed, so as to, so repeated twice. And in page 17, universal enrollment became, in the typo, universe enrollment. Likewise, there are some typos which I am sure the Oxford University Press would take in the second issue to be brought out of this book. I'm quite sure the book must have sold, and it will, the second edition will come out very soon, 2021. Thank you very much. I thank all of you, especially Sri Chakrapali Garu, for giving me this opportunity. I am extremely grateful to Sri Vaijanatha Iyer for giving me this unique opportunity of making my presentation on him, before him. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saravaru, for this very detailed, very incisive, and a very lucid exposition of the contents of that book, Holy Grail. Do any of our friends, would they like to make any observations? I noticed that Professor Hemchandra Reddy, chairman of the AP State Council of Higher Education, is there. Would you like to say anything, sir?
Sir, thank you for the opportunity given. Vaidyanathan Iyer, sir, very good morning to you. Good to see you after a long time. So, sir, a book written by a stalwart and reviewed by another stalwart. I had a wonderful opportunity to interact with Vaidyanathan Iyer ji, and it was such a pleasant experience, learning experience, interacting with him. And I'm blessed I could receive some of his earlier works, and I went through it. He is an encyclopedia by himself, particularly with regard to education in India and also in Andhra Pradesh. He worked as a MHRD secretary. He was with Andhra Pradesh dealing with education. So he completely knows ins and outs of the entire education system. Now, the emergence of DPEP and how Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan emerged, it was. I'm just looking forward to going through that book. But Vishweshwar made our job so simple. He narrated almost all salient features of that, and the review was. I don't think anyone could have reviewed it better than Vishweshwar did this morning. He is a scholar to the core, and he almost made our job so simple. I think the gist is absorbed now. We can readily go through that book. I'm looking forward to going through that book and then interacting with IRG, about some of the points that we can take here on. Sir, in our interactions, I already told you that state government of Andhra Pradesh is taking many initiatives to improve the education system in general and school education system in particular. I think this book will be a proper guide to us in the policy making, and I'm sure we will at the government level will take up some of these points which can be implemented, and if possible, I'll come down to Hyderabad to have a discussion on this. Thank you very much. And Vishweshwara Garu, as usual, you made it such a lively event. Thank you.
Thank you
Professor.
very much.
Thank you, Professor Hemchandra Reddy garu. Any other person, Mr. Shiva Panindra? Would you like to say something? He's a young lecturer from Vinukonda.
Yeah, so very good morning to all of you. I have very slow internet connection, so I could not unmute my video. Sorry for that.
No, doesn't matter. Yeah.
So I heard the entire session, sir. I think it's almost like reading the entire book. All the key points were noted, but I just want to, since there are many dignitaries here, I just want some comments from you on the topic related to primary education. In Andhra Pradesh, if you take the case of Andhra Pradesh, there are around 45,000 schools, government schools, 45,000 government schools, in which around 40 lakh students are studying. So it's averages to almost 100 a school. Do we think that we need so many schools? Because in one town there will be 3, 4, 5, 6 schools with very small building, maybe 1 or 2 rooms. Why can't we merge all these schools and build big schools? It will certainly improve the quality of education. I just want your comments on this, sir.
Whose comments are you seeking? Are you asking for Sri Vaidyanath Iyer's comments?
Both of you, sir.
Sir, Vaidyanath Iyer, sir, may I look forward to your response first so that I may come after you? Because the problem is, the one important issue here is that for retention, one very important factor is the proximity of the school to the area where the student. Proximity matters a great deal.
Why can't the government run school buses like private institutions? Run school buses like private institutions.
That is one thing. Now, technology, there can be classrooms as may be distributed in various geographical locations, including disadvantaged geographical locations. But from a central arena, the teacher speaks, which is a system which puts less pressure on qualified teaching staff and our having to train those teaching staff and make them adequately, so that in the training in the room there aren't gaps left.
Would you like to say anything, sir? Vaidyanath Iyer garu? You can unmute and then speak. If you click on the icon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there is a trade-off between a large school and access. If Andhra is like Kerala, where Kerala is one big village, and you will find that, people can, you will find the whole buses full of students going to big schools. But Andhra, unfortunately, some areas are densely populated, but large areas are scattered population. For example, take the agency. In the agency, even if you run a bus, the distance the student has to travel will be quite enormous. So if 2 hours of a day are lost in travel itself, for him to go back and study will become a problem. That is the reason why I think right from the beginning, the importance of having a school within a particular distance. For example, primary schools, I think it is about 1 kilometer. Whereas if it's going to the high school, it is about 10 kilometers or so. So I think there is, we cannot totally do away with small schools. But perhaps Mr. Dagupati's idea can be tried out in large cities where buses are available. Students can travel and come back in a brief time. Therefore, one uniform fit, one size fit for all type of policy is not possible.
Yeah, even I mean the same, sir. Of course, we cannot remove the entire schools, but wherever it is possible, we can merge the schools.
That's what the new education policy is also trying to aim at in terms of the 2020 policy. Yeah. Mr. Seshagir Rao, would you like to say anything? Seshagir Rao is retired as Deputy Registrar of the Open University. You can
Good morning.
unmute it. Yeah.
Yes, I did it. First of all, Viswesvarrao garu, namaskaram.
నమస్తే మిమ్మల్ని చూశాను నేను
ఓకే తర్వాత
మీ పేరు మీ అటెండెన్స్ మైండ్ లో రిజిస్టర్ చేశాను
ఓకే it's really has our chairman AP State Council of Higher Education M. Chandra Reddy pointed out, you really did very great job. It is now easy task for us to read the entire book. And Dr. Vaidyanath Iyer was our former Vice Chancellor, in charge Vice Chancellor at our university. I had an opportunity to work with him for more than 1.5 years when he was in charge Vice Chancellor. And I know for his precision and perfection. Basic doubt what I want to raise is, in the new education policy, the availability of technology, modern technology to the rural areas is not specifically mentioned. And what the government is proposing to do if rural areas are aspiring for better education facilities. That's only this one. I could not read anything from the new education policy document. Sir, my references to you, Dr. Vaidyanath Iyer, sir.
Viswesvarrao, would you like to say anything?
Sir, I think Seshagir Rao garu, the National Education Policy 2020 envisages a large-scale infiltration of technology system. Irrespective of whether a region is a rural or disadvantaged area or something else. So, and also the government of India in the Digital India program is planning to increase the bandwidth and take that extended increased bandwidth to the remote locations of the country in order to facilitate the e-classroom and certain other online modalities. That's my feeling. I'm sorry if my reading Education Policy 2020 does not meet your expectations.
Mrs. Rama Devi, would you like to say anything?
Sir.
Rama is a nutrition expert with, yeah.
More than that.
Go ahead, Mrs. Rama. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. And today I'm speaking more as mother and less as my subjective person. It's an excellent evolutionary journey of the educational policy, which is very well brought out by the author. And I heartily congratulate you, sir. And I also congratulate the reviewer for such an eloquent analysis and presentation. It's almost like we have read the book. I don't think he has missed any salient points at all. Now, presently, my grandchildren are going through distance education. It's a point of concern for us. I mean, whatever this online education. So, as I notice what you have mentioned about the distance education, probably it's kind of applicable to this present scenario. And so maybe the author should write, we should also write some kind of an annexure to this book so that certain systems and norms are followed for the children, various groups, various age group. I mean, that's about it. The other policies, I'm not very familiar, but I think it's an excellent presentation. Chakapanigar, you must have this on the YouTube and to all the other education experts. Thank you. Congratulations again on such an excellent literary presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Rama. It will be certainly uploaded on the YouTube and it will be available for all. Yes, Vishweswaravan.
Sir, I think overall the impression that is gathering momentum, also ideas received from Sri Bhajan is that the ODL STEMs need a lot of academic strengthening. We have been with education, but we have not evolved requisite pedagogy for it. And the National Education Policy 2020 is an elaborate pedagogy framework for it. It even consists of a project whereby some of the models are stored, digitalized, and made available across various e-classrooms. So this is an area where a lot of training for the teacher is also necessary. We've introduced it in haste, but then the appropriate training in the pedagogical models suitable for this, the reception is on the part of the student. All these studied at greater length. Now trying to counter an emergency situation, and after this emergency situation is over, we'll ponder over this whole subject in depth and detail.
Yeah, thank you.
Sir,
And
can I add?
yes, Mrs. Rama.
I have noticed something for little children. It was 4th class, 5th class, that they are having live teaching online as well as recorded teaching online. So if it's a recording teaching, why should a child get to school at all? So some such policy must be taken, and then something must be done about all these. Just not, it's because of the emergency situation we have hit upon all this, but I think some kind, because it's going to be a new norm, I think. So some policies must be studied and taken both for the benefit of the teachers and the students. Thank you.
Thank you, Rama. Mr. ISM Raju. Okay, yeah, you were saying something?
Sir, may I first Professor Sri Vaijanatha Iyer Garu give his response to my review and also whatever he has to say on aftermath of the DPEP project.
Yeah, before he does it, I have 1 or 2 points, sir, with your permission.
Yes, sir.
One is, I think you have already referred to as the inability of the states to strengthen both the diets and the SCERTs. Now, do you think something can be done on this over a period of time? The second is, there's a total absence of mentoring of institutions in the hierarchy. Mentoring of an institution which is below a particular level by a higher institution or individuals in that institution. The third, sir, is the linkage between the scientific bodies and the respective institutions, at least those which are locally available. I find that these linkages are totally absent. In fact, I also find that now that there are a number of triple ITs are there all over the country, probably there is need for a very strong linkage between these technical institutions and the schools on the one hand, and the technical institutions and the universities on the other, because a lot of effort today, both in the field of education and health, is through technology. So maybe after giving your response to Professor Vishweshwara's review, you may like to touch upon these aspects.
Thank you, Mr. Chakrabani, for the opportunity. I should thank Professor Vishweshwara for his kind words, I would say, because I think he has brought out what is perhaps good in the book and not the many lacunae which I am aware now. Now, I should thank you, sir, for a very lucid and elaborate presentation. The next point I want to emphasize is why I began writing these books. Now, firstly, while in government, we don't try to be reflective. I had an opportunity to be reflective because, again, Bodia said you must read history of education. Don't just do your job. Read the history of education so that you can relate what you are doing with what the great thinkers have thought about education. Because like philosophy, which is perennial, there are only awkward perennial questions and awkward answers. Same thing with education also. And then I had a great opportunity to work, to study with a professor called Sabinius in Harvard when I went there for a year sabbatical. And he brought out a total reorientation in my attitude to government. He brought out that everything you do in government is negotiation. It may be formal negotiation or it may be informal negotiation. And don't think that rationality by itself can bring out everything. And then after retiring, when I began to reflect, and luckily for me, I began teaching students. When I began to teach students public policy in Bangalore, IIM, I had a great difficulty because I focused on process and politics and not merely theoretical policy analysis. And there was hardly any material in the public realm for developing cases. Mercifully, I think C. Subramaniam of Green Revolution fame, he wrote very extensively how he developed Green Revolution. And then Sivaraman was there, who was a secretary, was a member, cabinet secretary, and all that. So he also wrote how the Green Revolution was developed. So rather than only talk about the pluses and minuses of a policy, how the policy is made was very neatly brought out them. And I myself began to write cases based on my experience in the government so that they can be used for teaching. And then after some time, I thought that I should, instead of only teaching, I should devote myself to full-fledged writing. And I wrote 2 books on education. The first is the Holy Grail, which Professor Vishweshwara Garu has reviewed. Second thing is a history of education policy in making, almost from the Indian Education Commission of 1883 to 2016. Because in 2016, people were expecting that the policy will come out any moment. But then I couldn't go on waiting for the policy to come out to complete my book. And now, just now, I have completed a book on how the internet treaties have come up. I was leader of the Indian delegation to a diplomatic conference on copyright in the internet days. I was also chairman of the drafting committee. So I have just now completed the book and hopefully I will take up cultural policy and administration. So this is the background for this. So when I am doing a documentation, I should present the facts in a very lucid narrative and also be self-critical. There's no point in just go on saying, like most civil servant memoirs, that I'm the greatest, I defied this minister, I did that, I did this. So it is more some sort of a, that's why I wanted to detach myself. That is the reason why I wrote this books. Then coming to uh, uh, Professor Viswesvarao also raised it and you also raised it. Why is it that institutions are not being mentored? Why is that SCRT diets and all that remain so anemic? Now, part of the reason is that is the point which I discovered and I wrote in the end also. Nobody has tried to address the structural problems of the education departments, state education departments. Now, you have a problem, you appoint an IAS officer. Okay, he does a good job. But then he may learn something, but he will move out to something else. But unless the education departments are professionalized, which unfortunately I have to plead guilty in this. We ourselves try to get into all sorts of departments and don't allow the departmental functionaries to be professionalized. That is a major reason. And SCRTs and diets, there is a big question. But I think once upon a time, when I was in sales tax and Krishnaswamy was commissioner, I requested him to relieve me of administrative burden and only give me the task of attending, reforming the administration, refining the law. So he said, he laughed at that, you are foolish. If you don't have administration in your hand, you can't do any change. Today, what is happening is in a CRT, in your diets and all that, people who are unwanted in education department are usually posted in such positions. So he is just waiting for an opportunity to get back to the education department. And so the point is, number one, we have not thought about strengthening the education department and professionalizing their functionaries. And number two, these institutions have become the haven of whoever is unwanted. Like, for example, state archives does a very great work on museums in states. Unwanted officers are sent like that. Then, as far as linkages are concerned, as they say, there is nothing old under this, new under the sun. Now, these linkages, as early as Kothari Commission has, see, for example, he thought there will be a lead school in each district, which will support the smaller schools. And similarly, there was also a discussion from time to time that universities, particularly these university education departments, must try to do something for the schools and all that. But unfortunately, what happens is, unless there is an incentive to have linkages, just by giving a government order or writing in some report, it doesn't happen. And everybody is now busy with his own. If, for example, if you say take JNTU, JNTU is so busy with organizing its exams, running the classrooms and other things, for it to take care of the technological aspects of the schools and all that. So these linkages are easy to say about, but very difficult to be accomplished. And therefore, unless there is an incentive, for example, some professor of technology is taking interest in strengthening the education technologies in schools, you have to provide an incentive for him, because his whole reputation among the peers is not by having linkages, but publishing how many papers have you published, how many PhD students have you gained. So I think that we must create some sort of incentives for linkages. I forgot the other questions, and if there is anything you want me to tell, I will tell. Otherwise, I should thank Viswesvarao Garu, Seshagirao Garu, and of course Professor Hemachandra Reddy, with whom I had an opportunity to interact, and others.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very, very detailed analysis, Viswesvarao Garu, and also Mr. Vaidyanathan for being present with us throughout and trying to tell us the background of the factors that prompted him to write and reflect and write on various aspects of education. And I'm also extremely grateful to very senior functionaries like Mr. Hemchandra Reddy, chairman of the APSHI, Justice Narayana, who has been very patiently listening, member of the Mahadayi Water Disputes Tribunal, and all friends who participated in this program, like Mr. Sai Baba, Mrs. Ramadevi, Mr. Seshagiri Rao, Mr. Siva Fanindra. This will be certainly uploaded on the YouTube channel. And next week, we'll be taking up another book, a book written by Ramila Thapa, The Voices of Dissent. And that's being reviewed by Professor Haragopal. At the same time, I do hope that all of you, or at least some of you, would be able to join us in this discussion. I must thank Dr. Y.V. Reddy, Y. Venugopal Reddy Garu, who actually started this practice of book club in my earlier stay at Hyderabad, about 10, 12 years back. It is the cause of his inspiration that we started the book club in the IAS Association, and we've been able to carry this tradition on after I came back from Bapatla. I do hope that we'll be able to meet the expectations of all friends. There'll be different presentations from various persons who have done very well in different walks of life, science, health, education, etc. And I do hope that we would have a very, very effective participation. Thank you very much, sir.
This is available on YouTube.
It will be available, sir. We'll suitably edit it and put it in the next 2-3 days in the YouTube channel. It's Jignasa channel.
What Jignasa?
Jignasa. We'll be sending a message in the health and wealth group so that it will be very easy for you. Thank you very much, all of you, sir. Thank you. Wonderful having all of you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.